Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony. I keep hearing from some of my Republican colleagues that the Trump tax cuts brought better outcomes for American workers. I would just point out that it's a fact that real wages grew faster during President Obama's second term than during the Trump years, and that doesn't include the Trump years after COVID hit. So the notion that this $2 trillion tax cut was a great boon to American workers and wages just doesn't bear out under any scrutiny. What we know it brought us was $2 trillion added to the deficit and debt, and a huge amount of additional stock buybacks. And I want to focus for a moment on the stock buybacks, because they went from approximately $368 billion a year in 2016, 2017, to what Goldman Sachs estimates will be about $1 trillion this year. Secretary Reich, let me just ask you to talk a little bit about the connection between those Trump tax cuts and ongoing stock buybacks. And as I think everybody agrees, all the witnesses agree, those are great from the perspective of the stockholders. I mean, you have a large share of those stockholders, I would point out, are overseas investors that are pocketing those gains. But clearly, the argument that they were going to go to higher wages and more investment just didn't bear out. So, Secretary Reich, if you could start by just talking about what the incentives from that bill, what created and what we're still living with.
Yes, Senator. We were promised, the American public was promised, you recall, before the Trump tax cuts, that everybody would get a raise, a wage raise, and that there would be a huge new round of investments in America. Neither of those came to pass. Instead, corporations used the money that they otherwise would have spent, otherwise would have been taxed. The revenues they actually spent on corporate buybacks. I think it's important to understand that stock buybacks do not generate more productivity in the economy. There is no trickle down from a stock buyback. When corporations use their record profits, as they're doing right now, to buy back their own shares of stock, what they're doing is delivering higher returns to their shareholders, because buybacks reduce a company's shares outstanding, pushing its profit per share figure higher. They hit a new record last year. They're on the way to hitting an even larger record this year. It helps the share price, but it amounts to a redistribution from workers and consumers to shareholders. Because in an inflationary environment, as we are in right now, when highly profitable companies are using their profits to buy back shares, and they are raising their prices at the same time, what happens is consumers pay more. Workers, even if they've got a raise, are losing those raises because they're losing them to inflation. And shareholders do better. But as we all know, most shareholders, half of this stock market is owned by the top 1% of Americans by income, and 84% is owned by the top 10% of Americans by income. This is how you get the redistribution upward.
Dr. Owens, one of the proposals that was in the House passed Build Back Better agenda was a modest excise tax on stock buybacks. I don't know if you're familiar with the proposal and what your view of that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing buybacks are good for, aside from shareholders, and I completely agree with the Secretary that buybacks do nothing for innovation, nothing for productive investment. But you should remember they're also really good for executives. Executives are frequently compensated in stock. They announce a round of buybacks, share prices go up. And guess what we see in the research? In the days following one of those buyback announcements, executives are more likely to cash in that stock. So I think if we want CEOs' incentives, shareholders' incentives, corporate incentives aligned with what we care about in the real economy, building worker power, building an economy that works for all of us, taking on buybacks is a critical piece of that. The House passed proposal could do that. President Biden put out a proposal in his budget that's nice as well. I think there are a lot of options here.
Thank you. I guess my time's out. We have, okay. Well, we have a professor from the great Smith School at University of Maryland. Good to see you. So I did want to press you on one issue, which is the House Build Back Better legislation. And people can have disagreements, obviously, over the elements, but it is paid for. You would agree with that?
I would not. As Senator Graham pointed out in his opening statement, once you recognize that these temporary measures are going to be made permanent, CBO estimates that it will add $3 trillion to the debt.
Right. But if you look at what CBO does is the actual, the law, right, budget projection, it is paid for. We've got lots of tax cuts around here that some of them have expired by law, some have been extended. But just in terms of the legislation itself, it is paid for on its face, right? You're assuming that the future Congresses will extend the tax cuts. That's your assumption, right?
I'm assuming future Congresses will extend some of the spending programs. That's right.
And the tax cuts.
Well, yes. So things like the refundable child tax
and not the
tax extended. Yeah. But yes,
right. So I think in terms of the near-term impact on sort of for inflation, to the extent that you've got tax revenue coming in, offsetting expenditures, in that sense, at least in the first number of years, it would be neutral. I don't want to prolong the conversation. My time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.